I'm John Weingart. I'm the Associate Director here of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. And one of the enterprises we're involved with is a Center on the American Governor. And I should say, before I say that, if you have a cell phone, please silence it. Anything else I'm supposed to say? That was the thing, right? Okay. So some of you have heard this before, but we sort of inherited a lot of papers connected to Governor Brendan Byrne. And in the course of figuring out what to do with them, we became aware that there is not an academic center in the country focused on the office of the governor. There are some focused on individual archives of individual former governors. So we've been trying to do something about that. And we're trying to collect a lot of information about the recent governors of New Jersey, particularly Governors Byrne, Kane, Florio, and Whitman, but also collect other information about the office of the governor across the country, governors. So we have a website, governors.rutgers.edu, with essays about governors who ran for president and vice president, and how many won and how many lost, and a number of other topics like that. And we're trying also, in the course of doing this, we collect odd pieces of information that it's not quite clear how to categorize them on a website. But the most recent one is in discussions about the line item veto, the power that the New Jersey governor exercises more frequently than at other points in history. Other governors have that too. And I learned last week that a former governor of Wisconsin is considered to have had the most creative use of the line item veto. And this was Governor Anthony Earl of Wisconsin, who served in the late 1970s. And he wanted to achieve a result. And you know, the line item veto is the governor can't add words, but he or she can take words out of the budget bill passed by the legislature. So in order to achieve a particular result, he took a paragraph of 5 sentences and reduced it to 121 words. It was 121 words originally. He reduced it to one sentence of 22 words and got the outcome he wanted. The legislature then overrode his veto. But forever after, apparently in Wisconsin, that's referred to as a Vanna White veto. And also, according to Wikipedia, it's known as a Frankenstein veto. Among the things we've been doing is collecting information about, as I say, about governors historically in New Jersey. And one of the things we're looking for is what is it about governors that can cross timeline, so that the work of a governor in one period of time could be instructive to a contemporary governor, or can cross state lines, and also just the history of it, of what's interesting and can be kept in an organized form that scholars can make use of and history buffs can make use of. So with that as background, we're really delighted to be able to celebrate the publication of the second edition of this book, The Governors of New Jersey, Biographical Essays, which came out originally in 1974 with essays about the governors who had served until that time through Governor William Cahill. And now this new one is just coming out with chapters on the governors who have served up until the present one. So it ends. You'll be disappointed to know it ends with John Corzine. It does not go past that. I wanted to welcome a number of people here who are relevant to this book in different ways. First of all, Governor Florio. Also, Dick McCormick is former president of Rutgers and current history professor and education professor at Rutgers. And they're the authors of some of the chapters in this book. So the new book has a chapter on Donald D. Francesco that was written by Peter Miklaus, who's there. And the chapter on Jim McGreevey was written by Tom O'Neill. And Fred Herman, who is here, wrote chapters on 2 governors that appeared in the original volume, Daniel Haynes and Charles Stratton, who were in the 1800s, right? 1800s? They were in the 1800s, okay. 1840s. So thank you all for coming. Michael Birkner, who's going to speak to us now, is a professor of history at Gettysburg College. He is a native of Teaneck, New Jersey. He's written 12 books, including the book McCormick of Rutgers, about President McCormick's father, He is also, among his many honors, the holder of the Robert McCormick Research Fellowship from the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library from a while back. He wrote a book called A Country Place No More, The Transformation of Bergenfield, New Jersey. And he is one of the 3 co-editors, along with Peter Miklos and Don Linke, of this new book. And it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome, Michael Birkner.
Well, it is a pleasure to be here, and I thank you, John, for introducing me, and most importantly, for inviting me to this pleasant place, and with the folks here who are interested in a topic like the governor's. I'm glad to have the opportunity to do this, and it seems that this is an especially relevant time to talk about the governorship of New Jersey. We've had something called lane closures at the George Washington Bridge, which have brought a little attention to the state, and as you all know, seemingly small events can have major implications. The lane closings issue, which has just dominated MSNBC and even the New York Times of late, has certainly changed our perceptions of the current governor and conceivably have narrowed his opportunities, you might say closed his lane to a presidential candidacy. Time will tell on that score. I want to acknowledge, before getting into the talk, the New Jersey Historical Commission for providing the financial backing for the new edition of this book. It wouldn't have happened, quite frankly, if they had not stepped forward and said, we need to do this. And it's certainly a worthy project on its own stand, but when you think about this being the 350th anniversary of New Jersey, it's doubly pertinent. My co-editors, Peter Miklos and Don Linke, join me in thanking Marley Wasserman, Maxine Lurie, and all the others involved in supporting this enterprise. They were great, and you see the end result, and you can judge for yourself. Let me start by telling a little story about something that happened in 1982 when an event was held at the state capitol to mark the publication of the first edition of the governor's book. And at that occasion, the new governor of New Jersey, Tom Kean, was invited to speak. And he had been in office for only a few weeks and hadn't really gotten fully the hang of the job, but he knew he liked it. But he said something really interesting. He said that he had a gulp in his throat after he went to a governor's conference the week before this symposium, and having been told that the governors of 2 other states, Illinois and Tennessee, had just been thrown in prison for their misdeeds in office. And this got quite a rise out of the audience, and at the same time, it reminded you of something very important, that the governorship, like other public office, is a public trust. And Tom Kean certainly, as his, I think, observers would say to a person, was an outstanding governor, and we'll talk a little bit more about him. Let me put some governors on if this will go forward. It's not moving. Do you think it's hit the escape key? Top left. All right, and is it going to move now? There we go. We got a few governors for you. In talking about the New Jersey governorship, there are many different angles you can consider. I don't consider myself an expert on all elements of the governorship, but I do have a special angle of vision about the governors, because I worked on this project not just once, but twice, since I was involved with the original edition over 30 years ago. And watching the governors parade by governor as you're editing essays and learning about their pluses and minuses gives you a special perch, I think, to make some sense of the governorship of New Jersey and to get some patterns out of the whole experience. I'm going to focus on 3 main themes in my talk today, and then we can open the floor and follow whatever angle you're interested in talking about, and I welcome comments and questions about any of this. The 3 areas that I want to talk about are the powers of the office as they've evolved, and I'll spend a fair amount of time on that. The quality of the governors of New Jersey over the years will be number 2, especially so the governors of the modern era. And finally, the issue of corruption and scandal. This is, after all, New Jersey, right? So we have to talk about it, although it isn't, surprisingly enough, a major element of what I have to say. I want to talk first about powers. When I was invited to co-edit the original edition of this book, I was a youthful PhD student at the University of Virginia back in the late 1970s. I really, even though I was a New Jersey boy, didn't know very much about New Jersey governors, especially so of the colonial period. And I went into the project with an assumption that proved to be rather mistaken. I just assumed that New Jersey's colonial governors were powerful. After all, the proprietary governors, served from 1664 to 1702, were big shots in East and West Jersey, respectively. They were men of means. They had the right connections. Presumably, they had a lot of clout. And the royal governors, who served from 1702 to 1776, were governing with the imprimatur of the monarch across the ocean, usually a man, not always a man, representing royal authority in His Majesty's colony, or in the case of Queen Anne, Her Majesty's colony. So presumably they were powerful too because they had the royal scepter. Wrong, or at least mostly wrong. It turns out that on closer examination, the most operative words in talking about governors of New Jersey from the founding into the Revolutionary period would be words like these: frustrated, disengaged, tormented by local elites who were determined to have their way. And I'm glad Maxine is nodding in a positive way because she knows more about this than I do. Now, it is true that several of the governors who served New Jersey in the colonial period were diligent and, for certain periods at least, reasonably effective. People like Lewis Morris, who's pictured here, and Francis Bernard and William Franklin, who's pictured on the left up there, come to my mind, although Bernard served for only 2 years in New Jersey and then he got bumped up to Massachusetts. In Franklin's case, his effectiveness lasted only until serious resistance to the British Crown, and you know the policies of equity and efficiency and how everything began to spin out of control for royal authority in the whole 13 colonies. So Franklin's period of effectiveness was also quite limited. New Jersey's governors in the colonial era were in the main people who had the right connections. People who hoped to parlay these connections, I might add, into something good for them, which usually meant something financially good for them. Now, it didn't work out for most. Some of them, like Andros, who's pictured there, who served in the 1680s, tried to enhance their influence at the Crown by doing what they thought would be the Crown's bidding, namely clamping down on the proprietors and their freedom from paying duties to the king. Well, that didn't work out well for Andros at all. Didn't work out much better for him when he left New Jersey and went to another colony. His campaign of persecution against Philip Carteret, who had served as the colony's first governor, only actually harmed Andros. But by and large, it did not matter whether a governor were forceful or not. As Patricia Bonomi has reminded us in a really wonderful book on Lord Cornbury, and I'll get to that very shortly, in an age before party politics had really emerged or taken hold either in England or the American colonies, local elites played politics without rules, which meant it was anything goes. And that meant the dirtier the better, any tool possible, any tool necessary, any tool available to tear down executive authority that might impinge on local interests. And therein lies a tale. Probably the most famous New Jersey governor of the colonial era, or infamous if you will, was Edward Hyde, known as Lord Cornbury. For about 3 centuries, the one thing he is known for best is that he was the state's only transvestite governor, because he allegedly dressed in women's clothing so as to better represent his sovereign, who happened to be Queen Anne. Now, there's more to this. Cornbury's road to the governorship of New Jersey was quite unexceptional. He was well born in England. He had military experience. He had excellent connections with the Crown, and he needed money. There it was. In 1702, the proprietors of East and West Jersey surrendered their charters to the Crown, and Queen Anne decided to combine them into a single royal colony and appoint Cornbury as the governor. Now, so far as that goes, that's completely ordinary. That's just the way it worked in the colonial period. Plus, Cornbury's goals as governor were pretty much standard. He wanted to assert royal authority, and he wanted to make money if he could. Well, it didn't work out. It didn't work out on either end. Thanks in part to the consistent and debilitating opposition of local elites, most notably Lewis Morris. it was in the context of the hardball game that Morris and his friends played against Cornbury, which included allegations of bribery and corruption, that the transvestite issue emerged and was bruited widely. And that's where you get that amazing portrait that's supposedly Cornbury. The word about by Cornbury's enemies was that he walked around town dressing in women's clothing. In one account of the story that you can readily find on the internet, there were 4 letters written by 3 different people, all enemies of Cornbury's, I might add, who said that this was his habit, to walk around town in women's clothing. The identification of Cornbury as a cross-dresser has been in the popular press about New Jersey governors ever since, and it still is for that matter. I might add, mea culpa, the 1982 edition of our book runs this picture and just says, Lord Cornbury. And the author of the essay basically says the same things about Cornbury that his enemies had said. In other words, accepts the transvestite notion. Now, there's a little problem there. And one of the things that's a problem is that not a single person who knew Cornbury who wasn't an enemy ever said one word about him dressing in women's clothes. And you have to always ask yourself, who's saying it? If his friends or people who were detached, and if there were any detached observers, they would have noticed this and said something about it in a letter, in a diary, or something else. Never done. Only his enemies write this. The second element here is, if you look at this oil painting, which, you know, is attributed to Cornbury, you ask yourself, all right, how did it get attributed to be Cornbury? The earliest identification of Lord Cornbury as the subject of this oil painting occurred in 1867 in an exhibition at the New York Historical Society. Someone slapped a label on it saying, Edward Hyde, Lord Cornbury. There's no provenance, there's no background, there's no, if you will, research into it. Professor Bonomi is the person who began to unravel this story in her great book. And as she points out, Cornbury was basically a victim, not a transvestite. He was a victim of political smear. And what Bonomi does that's so excellent is that she doesn't simply write a tunnel history. She opens this out into colonial American history in the 18th century to make an argument that in an era before you have organized politics, you have disorganized personal politics, which often can be a politics of vendetta. And now, of course, Governor Florio may know something about that in the modern era, I don't know, but because politics ain't beanbag, we understand that. But the sheer personal side of personal attack, which was the dominant part of politics at this time, basically brought Cornbury down. What Bonomi argues is that this was a guy who was not particularly good, not particularly bad, but he never was able to get on top of the attacks on him, which made him out to be awful. He was a pawn, in other words, not a tyrant, not a corrupt leader, not eccentric. I might just say as a footnote to all of this that in our book, we commissioned a new essay on Cornbury, which draws on Patricia Bonomi's research and which offers a much more, I think, balanced interpretation of his governor's years. Now, let me come back to the broader story. The colonial governors were not nearly as powerful then as you might expect them to be. They were caught between the dynamics of provincial politics, which was usually factional and intense, as I said, and imperial patronage, which put them in office. They didn't have the tools to govern effectively. And so those thinking about the governorship as a power base don't need to envy the colonial era governors. Let me add now, you don't need to envy the governors who followed under the Constitution of 1776. And I'm not going to give a long lecture about this, but at least a brief reminder that the American Revolution was in many ways a revolution against executive authority. Of course, taxation without representation was part of that. But generations of students, certainly me, certainly Fred Herman and others of our generation, were influenced by the writing of Dick McCormick, too, were influenced by the writing of Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood, which delineated the ideology of the revolutionary elite and their fears of unchecked executive power. The intersection of this ideology with American rebels' organized activity against the crown is the story of the American Revolution. And it's no surprise in this context that under the Constitution of 1776, New Jersey, as in many other states, indeed almost every other state, legislatures were considered the proper institutions of authority because they were direct from the people. And the governorship was more of a cipher than a strong figure. Certainly that's true in New Jersey. From 1776 until circumstances and, if you will, economic and social change led to the constitutional revision of 1844, the governor of New Jersey had no specific executive authority, very few patronage powers, very little that made him, and it was always a him at that time, a meaningful player. He had no formal influence in the making of legislation, no veto that was meaningful, no powers of fiscal control, very little in the way of appointment power. He commanded the state militia, big deal. Served as presiding judge of the highest appeals court, which sounds pretty good, but doesn't do much for separation of powers, and could cast a tie-breaking vote in the legislative council. Well, again, I would say big deal. The governor, in other words, was not a policy pusher or a policy implementer. Is it any surprise that under such an arrangement, some individuals of real ability chose not to stand for governor? We have the example, probably the outstanding example of this kind of thing, of a prominent party figure in the new second party system, Garrett Wall, actually turning down the office in 1829. What did he turn down the governorship of New Jersey for? He wanted to be, Chris Christie would like this, the U.S. Attorney for New Jersey. This was a patronage job in the gift of President Andrew Jackson, the incoming president, and so when Wall is formally elected governor by the Democratic caucus, he says, thanks, no. And he waits for the appointment from Jackson, he gets it, and then he parlays that eventually into a seat in the United States Senate, which is where the real action seemed to be. Just a few years after Wall turned down the governorship, another party leader, Samuel Southard, looking here like a Roman, good Roman, right, resigned only a few months into his term of office because, again, the governorship was not where power really lay. He was elected by the legislative caucus in 1832. He was able to stay in power long enough to write a denunciation of the nullification movement in South Carolina, and then when the legislature decided that he could get a seat in the Senate, he ran for it and went into the Senate and served for the rest of his life in the Senate. The job of governor didn't offer him much in the way of patronage or other influence, and very little opportunity for creative and constructive statesmanship, which is what he aspired to. This is an interesting broader point, and I think you're aware of this from your general reading of the newspapers. It used to be that the United States Senate was where the action was to get anything done. Now, if you're an aspiring political figure, the governorship is where you want to be because that's where you can accomplish things. In the Senate, you're basically, if you will, just rotating and rotating and rotating. Now, having said that, political power doesn't necessarily lie only in constitutional arrangements. And anybody who's read Dwayne Lockhardt's very fine little book written for the tercentenary will appreciate that. Governors can be effective, at least within a limited sphere, within constitutional arrangements that are not in their favor. And one of the first governors who reflected this was William Livingston, who was a really important figure in New Jersey history. He served under the 1776 Constitution for more than 10 years, and he led the state because of his, if you will, persona, his his character. He carried himself like a man you had to respect and you had to follow. He didn't have a lot of, as I say, constitutional clout, but he had what he was, and that mattered. And so, for that matter, did Joseph Bloomfield, not quite to the same degree, but Bloomfield would follow Livingston after a couple of other governors intervening, and he served 9 consecutive one-year terms early in the 19th century as the first Jeffersonian governor. He, like Livingston, had the experience of the Revolution and all of the prestige that came with that, and by his own, as again say, persona, he was able to carry forward with a program. I might add that Carl Prince and others have shown that still he had to contend with a legislative caucus that could in any time veto anything he wanted done, and for that matter, throw him out of office. And Prince shows that at various places along the way in his 9 years as governor, he came fairly close to being overthrown by the caucus, which was thinking of going in another direction. A third governor who would exercise a considerable amount of authority, or at least influence, in the 1776 Constitution is Peter Vroom, who essentially becomes the leader of the anti-monopoly movement within the Democratic Party in the 1830s in fighting the so-called joint companies, and of course joining Andrew Jackson in his fight against the monster bank, the U.S. Bank. I remember Jackson was going to kill the bank. Vroom was absolutely enthusiastic about that. Vroom, I should add, is an important transitional figure because even as he exerts a fair amount of authority in the state through his gubernatorial leadership. For example, after 12 years of a governor who didn't even bother to give a State of the State message, Vroom introduces a State of the State message where he's going to lay out a legislative program. That was a first step. But Vroom realizes that he does have relatively few tools to work with to be effective. And so he starts a campaign, along with others, including some Whigs, for a constitutional revision. And this would culminate ultimately in the Constitution of 1844. Vroom could see that in the hands of a lesser person, like, for example, Southard's successor, Elias Seeley, the governor was a complete cat's paw of the legislature. You have to change the game, he believed, by getting the governor elected directly from the people, and thereby giving the governor more authority because the governor had a mandate of some kind. Vroom also, as a lawyer, and a very good one, thought it was not just awkward, but inappropriate that the governor should, in effect, also be a jurist as the chancellor of the state. And so he wants to end the governor's tenure as chancellor and move to a true separation of powers. I might add, since Fred's in the audience today, that I've learned so much about how the state began to cope more effectively under the Constitution of 1844 with social and economic change that was, as you put it, Fred, putting stress on the system and how you needed new structures to handle that stress. And it seems to me that Vroom is very much understanding what needs to be done. And he does this, interestingly enough, from a very old-fashioned kind of agrarian republicanism, which is to stick up for the farmers against the monopolists. But yet he was engaged in a commercialized world, and he understood that you needed new structures for the state to, if you will, respond to the challenges of the day. And so we will see in 1844 that the governor will be elected by the people for a 3-year term. The governor will get a little bit more clout with a veto and have a bit more of patronage opportunities, although I would argue that still, for another century, the governor is not the top dog. At best, he can share authority with the legislature, and the legislature, for many of the years of this period, is still calling most of the shots. Among the exceptional governors, where the governor was the prime mover, Leon Abbott really stands out. He was the champion of regulation of railroads and of the interests of working people, and particularly the new immigrants who were really pouring into New Jersey and becoming a significant chunk of the population. He served 2 non-consecutive terms in the late 19th century. In the system that was adopted in 1844, a governor could not run for re-election, but you could sit out a term and then run. Abbott did that. And while he was not quite the paragon that he is made out to be in Richard Hogarty's biography, I think Hogarty does a good job in laying out why Abbott mattered and why he was exceptional in the strength that he brought to the office, again, through dint of his personal character, his persuasive abilities, his tenacity, and the enemies that he chose. That makes a difference, too. I'll come back to Abbott a little later. And then there's Woodrow Wilson, who showed in his brief tenure as governor that the governor of New Jersey could actually pass an ambitious legislative program. This was, of course, the height of the progressive era. Wilson was very much in sync with new thinking about the need to regulate big business. As one of the people in this room has reminded me, they discovered that business corrupts politics, and Wilson wanted to do something about that. And he did something about it, and he was successful enough that it launched his presidential candidacy in 1912, and ultimately, because of the split in the Republican Party, it got him into the White House. You all know, to this day, this is the person who has pride of place as the only New Jerseyan elected president. Although I gather the fellow who occupies the governor's chair today might have an idea or two about making a second president from New Jersey. It's not until 1947 that we reach the era of the modern governorship. It's not until then that the office has real authority infused into it. And it was a very intentional movement led by people like Walter Edge and Arthur Vanderbilt and Alfred Driscoll. Now, those of you who have read Alec McGillis's recent piece in the New Republic, I hope some of you read it, will recall that McGillis says that the governor of New Jersey is the most powerful governor in the nation. Well, maybe. Other observers, including someone who's well known here at Eagleton, the late Alan Rosenthal, are a little bit more restrained. In Rosenthal's last book, he and political scientist Ed Bile talk about the various measures by which you would rate a strong governor and in a state, and they would put New Jersey in the top 6 in the country, if you, just for what it's worth, according to Bale's calculations that Rosenthal draws on. The other strong governor states are Massachusetts, Alaska, Maryland, New York, and West Virginia. Whether New Jersey stands out above those, I guess, is a more subjective judgment. What makes the current governor's office powerful? Well, the New Jersey governor nominates the attorney general, nominates the treasurer, determines the size of the budget, fills hundreds of well-paying slots on the state's many commissions and authorities, and doles out aid to its hundreds of towns and cities. Now, just think of Christie in terms of the whole business of doling out aid. That's part and parcel of how he built his popularity. Think about the New York Times article today, which is really quite a remarkable example of how you use a commission for political purposes. In the words of Alec McGillis, no governor in modern memory has worked these levers as skillfully as Chris Christie. I'm really not convinced of that, because I've read the essays about our modern governors, and we've had some darn good modern governors, and effective, and I'm going to get into that. And in fact, I'm going to get into it now. This is just, if you will, a transition piece, because I felt I needed to put Richard Cody on here. I wanted to talk about the modern era governors, and I wanted to say flat out that New Jersey, since 1947, has produced a remarkable crop of governors, and I refer to elected governors. And one exemplary governor who was not elected, this fellow. If I were to play a parlor game in evaluating the governors since 1947, and I'm going to play it with you right now, not counting Christie, who's still in office, and hence we can't evaluate him fully yet, I would put the post-1947 governors in 4 categories. Outstanding, strong but deficient in some ways, mediocre, and disappointing. Utterly disappointing, in fact, was my word. So I'm then going to make the case that out of the state's 10 elected governors since 1947, 5 of them would be rated as outstanding. 3, strong but deficient in some ways. one mediocre, and one utterly disappointing. And of course, this is Michael Birkner's subjective judgment, but detached subjective judgment. Now, bear with me further. 60 years have passed between 1948 and 2008 when Christie is elected. In 39 of those years, I'm arguing that New Jersey had an outstanding governor. And again, recognizing I'm being subjective, my judgment, I'm referring to 5 two-term governors: Driscoll, Minor, Hughes, Byrne, Kane. 3 governors, and these are the 5 that I rank as outstanding governors of New Jersey. 3 governors, right here, Florio, Cahill, and Whitman, I would call strong governors, but deficient in certain ways. And let me add something here, and I especially need to do so with Governor Florio here, but I'm going to be a good historian, and I'm going to speak my mind. But I think that what I would say is that in the case of Cahill, Florio, and Whitman, what you have are 3 different circumstances that they're governors in, they serve in. And each of them has a problematic, and each of them deals with it in a way that does not redound to their benefit, which is why in Cahill and Florio's case, they do not get reelected. Cahill was dealing, among other things, with a recalcitrant legislature on the tax issue, and he was dealing with the fact that he appointed people who betrayed the public trust, and that killed him in his bid for reelection. Florio, we don't need to forget, took office at a time when the economy was tanking and where he had inherited a pretty dismal budget situation. And he dealt with it as he thought best, and it wasn't popular, and he still almost won re-election, and he did a lot of good things as governor. Whitman, in many ways effective, spoke for causes including advancing the role of women in politics and governance in a way that I think was very effective. She was a great national spokesperson. I think she really, in a way, disappointed the state ultimately and hurt the state in the way that she handled the fiscal situation the state was in. By kicking the can as she did in her pension dealings, Florio, to his credit, dealt with these issues head on. She basically said we can do it by a little bit of smoke and mirrors, and I think we're paying for that. Do I think Whitman, Florio, and Cahill were good people and in many ways good governors? Absolutely. I'm just saying they don't rise to that next level. Mediocre, Corzine. Utterly disappointing, McGreevey. I'll let that go. The 5 governors I list as outstanding are easily among the best 10 governors New Jersey has ever had. Joined in that elite group by the likes of Woodrow Wilson, Leon Abbott, William Livingston, Peter Vroom, and Joseph Bloomfield. I make no claims, by the way, of speaking ex cathedra on this, and it will be enjoyable to have some give and take from you, and perhaps you can enlighten me and get me to change my views. I'm open-minded and I'm curious, but I wanted to go a little deeper. For details of the modern governors, I want to refer you to the essays in the Governors of New Jersey, because they are good introductions to the basic issues and the politics of their governor years. Now, let me say something about Brendan Byrne. I lived in New Jersey. I was doing my doctorate at the time and writing my dissertation, and I didn't think much of Brendan Byrne. My image of Brendan Byrne, I wasn't coming up for air a lot. I was in the archives. But my image of Byrne was of a governor who liked to play tennis and liked to hobnob with celebrities. But this was as misleading an image as the notion that Dwight Eisenhower's presidency was defined by his love of golf. Thanks to modern scholarship, we now know that Eisenhower was one of the canniest, craftiest, and most effective presidents of the post-World War II era. I'll stake on that because I'm an Eisenhower scholar. As regards Byrne, all you have to do is take some time and read Don Linke's terrific essay about Byrne in our book to appreciate how many and significant were his accomplishments in his years as governor. I think if you read the essays on Driscoll, Minor, Hughes, and Kane, you'll also get a bit of state pride, seeing how these very different personalities inhabited the office in the best sense, setting priorities and making things happen. Compare the governorship of New Jersey even in the hands of people who were just good as opposed to outstanding. And you can see that the governorship offers ample opportunity for active leadership that you will not see in states like Texas or South Carolina, or I might add, in the governorship before 1947. Now, I'm in the home stretch. Before we open the floor to questions and comments, I thought I'd preempt a couple of your questions by talking briefly about the governors I like the most, which governors I found the most intriguing, and which ones I didn't like or warm up to. And then we can talk a little bit, very little bit about scandal, and then we'll go on. So far as liking governors, let me give pride of place to three very different characters, Vroom, Abbott, and Hughes. Vroom I liked because he reinvented himself as governor. He was a very insular person, and frankly in it because, like many lawyers, he wanted to get more business. But he began to invest himself in the issue of what was happening to the state of New Jersey and what was happening to its agricultural interest in particular. He fought the good fight during his 6 years as governor against corporate interests. And it would have been easier for him to play ball with Robert Stockton and the Camden and Amboy Corporation because they were fundamentally Democrats. Not all Democrats, but they were the people who had the money and who would have supported him. But he did not like them, and he fought them. The fact that he grew enamored of Jackson and Jackson's anti-corporate policies, particularly the war against the Bank of the United States, seems to have, if you will, raised Vroom's game. And while he never succeeded in unhinging the state from its agreements with the Camden and Amboy Railroad, he fought the good fight. And he also, as governor, used the powers of the office such as they existed to the maximum degree. He was able to use the bully pulpit through his legislative messages and also to work with the Democratic caucus to actually get some things through. Second, you have Abbott. That's Vroom. Here's Leon Abbott. Also a fighter. His fight, as I alluded to, was for working men's causes and for the rights of the new immigrants. He sponsored a law, and this enamors me of him, requiring employers to pay their workers in cash as opposed to paper scrip or company store merchandise. This is not a small matter if you're a working person. And it wasn't an easy fight, and he kept on with it. His greatest crusade was to tax the railroads, the leading corporate power in the state for decades. The railroads saw Abbott as their enemy. They fought him tooth and nail. But they lost their tax-exempt status while he was governor. And in this sense, you could argue that Leon Abbott was a harbinger of the progressive movement. In his second term as governor, Abbott pressed for the passage of new labor laws, free public libraries, scholarships, you'd like this, Dick, for Rutgers College students, highway improvements, funding for public schools, creation of new departments for banking and insurance. He's, in a way, New Jersey's version of Teddy Roosevelt before Teddy Roosevelt comes on the scene. He would step forward. And one way that I think this is really apt is that when I was in college, I learned about how Teddy Roosevelt in 1902 mediated the great coal strike. And for the first time, a president, instead of stamping on labor and sending the troops in, he actually says to the coal barons, you got to negotiate with labor, fair and square, and if you don't do it, I'll side with labor. I'm going to be the steward of the public interest. This is exactly what Abbott did in 1890 in a number of labor disputes in New Jersey. So while Abbott wasn't perfect, and no politician is, we know that, but he had associations with political bosses who were pretty noxious, but his overall record was admirable, especially when you compare him to those who preceded and succeeded him. Then Richard Hughes. Interesting that this man ever became governor. All he wanted to do was to be a district court judge. He was a genial jurist. Maybe I'm underestimating him. He did run for office several times. But he was considered a throwaway candidate in 1961. He was running against one of the strong figures in Dwight Eisenhower's cabinet, Jim Mitchell, at a time when New Jersey wasn't all that blue a state. Mitchell himself was a Catholic, an advantage, as was Hughes. Mitchell was a progressive Republican, a pro-labor Republican. So Mitchell had some real advantages, and Dwight Eisenhower was pitching for him. But elections are not won on the basis of the early pundit predictions. Hughes out-campaigned Mitchell. He benefited from the popularity of the new Kennedy administration, and he won an upset victory by barely 35,000 votes. Over the next 8 years, Richard Hughes transformed governance in New Jersey. He passed so many measures that impact New Jersey today that you could say, I'm saying it, that what he did was New Jersey's version of the Great Society. Among his notable achievements was negotiating a complex deal that made possible the construction of the World Trade Center, support for the expansion of New Jersey's system of higher education, urban renewal, the passage of a sales tax to support his expansion of government services across a broad spectrum, including the creation of the Department of Community Affairs and various criminal justice agencies, a Department of Consumer Protection, a Department of Transportation charged with upgrading rail and bus service, the construction of the Garden State Arts Complex in Homedale, the first ever funding for public broadcasting in New Jersey. That was a Hughes initiative, as was the first funding for the New Jersey Symphony. Hughes was critical to the establishment of the Hackensack Meadowlands Commission, which would plan the development of that vast tract of land in the northeasternmost part of the state where I come from. Hughes was staunchly supportive, as Dick McCormick's father, Richard McCormick, always reminded me of the tercentenary celebration of 1964, which I would argue was the single most important initiative in the history of the state in giving New Jerseyans a sense of identity and pride as New Jerseyans. The single most important effort ever. Now, intriguing. Walter Edge and Harry Moore, for very different reasons. I have to say that in following the recent Bridgegate scandal, one of the most amusing bits that have emerged for me was learning that David Waldstein's nom de plume as a blogger was Wally Edge. Those of you in the know what he was doing. This was a two-term governor who served, interestingly enough, during World War I and then during World War II. By most accounts, including the one in our book, Edge was an able governor. He was fiscally conservative, but concerned about more than balancing budgets. I would not dissent from giving Walter Edge a positive assessment as governor in either of his terms, much as the late Joe Mahoney does in his essay on Edge. We need to give Edge also, I would say, credit for at least three things beyond the specific legislation that passed during his governorships. First, he was a consistent supporter of constitutional reform. Second, he was a great supporter of Alfred Driscoll as his successor, and Alfred Driscoll was one of our outstanding governors. And third, as many of you know, he gave Morven his home to the state of New Jersey. And I can't help but tell you that one of my favorite memories of all time as a sixth grader was taking a bus trip with my class from Bergenfield High School down to Princeton to tour Morven. And when we got there, this bouncy woman came out of the house and acted as though she'd been waiting for weeks to see the sixth grade class from Bergenfield, New Jersey, and show them Morven. And I just got something out of that visit that has stayed with me for more than 50 years. She made us feel, again, happy. Now, Edge, he had another side to him that's not widely known, although it is becoming more widely known because of Boardwalk Empire, right? If you go to Edge's memoirs, A Jerseyman's Journal, look hard for an index entry to Nucky Johnson, and you won't find it. There's not a word about his relationship with the machine in Atlantic City. It turns out that Walter Edge played his politics in private on a different track than in his public persona. Ultimately, when Nucky Johnson was sent to prison, Edge airbrushed him out of his life story. And it's not a surprise, but it makes him intriguing because you want to know how much of what Steve Buscemi is doing in Boardwalk Empire and his interactions with Wally Edge are indeed relevant to history. And then Harry Moore. Harry Moore wins the Miss Congeniality Prize among New Jersey governors. If Will Rogers never met a man he didn't like, it could be said there wasn't anybody who didn't like Harry Moore. That helps explain his success in running 3 times for governor and once for the U.S. Senate, never suffered a defeat. Had he run for governor again for a 4th term in 1943, as Frank Hague desperately wanted him to do, I have little doubt Moore would have prevailed again, even against Walter Edge. Having the strong support of Frank Hague meant a lot in those days because he could deliver Hudson County the way that a Soviet premier might deliver the Soviet vote. It's said of Harry Moore that he had a special phone in his office in Trenton just to take calls from Frank Hague. I can't verify that story. It was told to me by my former co-editor, Paul Stelhorn. But it's almost as good as the line in Ken Burns' biopic about Huey Long, in which Burns claims that Long's successor as governor and his lackey, O.K. Allen, would sign anything that came across his desk, including a leaf that flew in through an open window. I wouldn't call Harry Moore a lackey, but Moore's own political career demonstrated that as popular as he was not a creative leader. He was not in sync with the zeitgeist of the 1930s. He certainly was not a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal, but he was a likable guy. There wasn't a service club he wouldn't visit or a charitable cause he wouldn't support. Harry Moore gives the lie to Leo DeRocher's notion that nice guys finish last. And then there are the governors I just can't warm up to. This is one of them. In the latter decades of the 19th century, all too many of the governors were creatures of political machines or allies of corporate interests, and in some instances, all too forgettable. One memorable name, George B. McClellan, was a disappointment as governor. He did the basics in terms of offering a legislative program, but he rocked no boats. He offered nothing creative and new, and as his biographer has observed, he stressed issues on which most people could agree. He was barely a factor in legislative deliberations, and he barely, indeed, involved himself in governance. At the close of his one term in 1881, McClellan wrote to a friend that he was glad it was coming to an end, and I'm quoting him, as it was becoming a nuisance to be obliged to go to Trenton. So much for the attractions of executive power, right? And in closing these remarks, let me say a word or two about scandal, since the whiff of scandal is clearly affecting our current governor's standing and his prospects for national office. Now, here's the interesting twist. New Jersey and scandal, perfect together, right? Well, no. In fact, when you look back synoptically over executive office in New Jersey and the governorship, there's very little scandal to find. I've already told you, probably at too great length, that the so-called Cornbury scandal wasn't a scandal at all, but a fabrication of his opponents. No New Jersey governor that I'm aware of has been impeached for crimes and misdemeanors and sent to the slammer. It's possible James McCreevy might have faced charges had he not resigned to proclaim himself a gay American, but I don't know that. If association with business people and political allies who were themselves borderline criminal or unethical were a criteria for talking about scandal, yes, then dozens of New Jersey governors would probably fit under that umbrella, among them the current governor, who earned his political spurs, as Alec McGill has shown us, by prosecuting corrupt officials and replacing them with another set of bosses with whom he could make profitable alliances. I don't say that to pass final judgment on Chris Christie. It's much too soon. We don't have all the facts. It's far too soon to write him off as a presidential contender even. I will say this. I'm very glad that my co-editors and I agreed that it would be unwise to commission an essay on Christie for our book while he was still in office. It's just too soon. We just don't know. I recall 3 decades ago when the first edition of this book came out and Governor Byrne, who was not in the book, came to the symposium that marked its publication. He took a semi-facetious jab at me and at Paul Stelhorn because we had not included him in the book. But I think today Governor Byrne would be pleased by how history treats him in the new edition. Perspective is not only important, it's essential. So when there's a new edition of the Governors of New Jersey someday down the line, I trust Chris Christie will get his just desserts one way or the other. I hope you won't take it as a double entendre like Time magazine's infamous November cover of Christie calling him the elephant in the room. I do hope you sustain your interest in New Jersey's governance and that as citizens, you demand the very best. So thank you very much. So John, do you want to?
Let me just say a word about, thank you, that was terrific, Michael. Our Center on the American Governor, there are a number of things on our website that are very directly relevant to what Michael said. There are interviews with Governors Byrne, Kane, Florio and Whitman. Some very interesting interviews with the governors themselves and with a lot of people who were in and around their administrations, including Jeff Laurenti, who was interviewed for an amazing number of hours on videotape. And you can go on our website and see the interviews, and many of them, there are transcriptions of them as well. Ray Bermucci, who was Commissioner of Labor in the Florio administration, there's a lovely interview with him there as well. And I just want to say a word about Morven and then open up this to questions. But one of the videos on the website is an interview I conducted with Jean Byrne, Brendan Byrne's wife, when he was governor. And since Brendan Byrne's first political office was being governor, I asked her what it was like to have had a family home for decades and then move to Morven. And her comment was, first of all, I very much resented that anyone called that dump a mansion. So now, so questions and comments for everybody?
Great line. All right, somebody's got an opinion or a question. Yes, sir.
One question that might be related to the power of the governors as they are right now. What's the thought of either some of the authors or you about the notion of an elected attorney general here in New Jersey?
Well, you're sitting next to a fellow who might want to comment. He's one of our authors, and he's been in Trenton for the last 30 years, as I have not been. Do you want to say anything, Fred?
Sometimes silence is golden, but my own personal sense is I like the way it's structured now. It is a constitutionally protected office. The Secretary of State and the Attorney General cannot be removed during the term of the governor. So that office structurally is independent. If we start electing them, that raises all sorts of other issues. And having been at ELAC, it raises campaign financing issues. So that would be my point.
Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
I'd like to know, share your comment on off-year elections. New Jersey is only one of 2 states, Virginia being the other one, has off-year election for the governorship. Could you give us a brief history of how that became about, and is there any possibility that it could ever change in the future?
Well, I'll be very frank and say I don't know when that began. It's been around for as long as I can remember, I guess. Remember, I'm thinking back to someone like Bob Miner's election in 1953. That was an off-year election, right? And in fact, Miner wasn't supposed to win that year either. That was supposed to be a Republican year, but it wasn't. So it's been around for a long time. I'm sure it can be changed if the state wants to change it, just as it got a lieutenant governor job into the system, which it never had. So I think it's just a matter whether the public wants it. I don't know if, Tom, you want to say something? Sure.
I think one of the things that has maintained that off-year election is that it increases the influence of the political leadership of the state because the off-year elections are smaller than the presidential year elections. The turnout is more predictable, and the turnout can in fact be affected by the use of street money and organization in a way that strengthens the political machinery as opposed to leaving it up to the tide that might carry in a president with someone who was not the choice of the political leadership of the state.
You know, I just figured out an answer to the first part of your question. I believe that we started doing this off year in the Driscoll years, because what happened was Driscoll was elected originally for a 3-year term, and then under the Constitution of 1947, he was elected for a 4-year term, and it just naturally flowed into 53 when he chose. He could have run again, but he didn't. So I think that's when it started.
What are the parameters for your term outstanding? What are the components?
Aha. I'm a historian, not a political scientist, so I don't have a metric. I know it when I see it. I think that you're looking at, several obvious things. I'm a presidential historian, and I think about what Fred Greenstein has talked about in his book, The Presidential Difference. And it has to do, does the person have emotional intelligence? Is the person able to use the bully pulpit? Does the person have a way of connecting to average people? Can the person then, at the same time, cajole or coerce the legislature to do what he wants? Does the person get through the things that person wants? One of the reasons Wilson was viable in 1912 was that he got a lot done. Bob Minor got a lot done in his 8 years as governor and actually had hopes of becoming vice president. And what really kind of hurt him was he was a Catholic, and he wasn't going to be asked to run for vice president under John F. Kennedy, so he held his, if you will, endorsement back from Kennedy. And you know the Kennedys don't forget, and they don't forgive either. And Bob Minor got nada from the Kennedy administration when he went out of office in '61. But Minor's strengths as governor, you know, got him boomed for president, or vice president at least. So I think that, you know, those are the basics. I think, do you have a strong persona? Do you do it without alienating the people you have to alienate? You don't want to alienate if you want to get your business through the legislature. And I think if you look at the 5 people that I called outstanding, they really did accomplish a heck of a lot. I could bore you to death with a laundry list. If you really want to know the particulars, they're in the book. Sir.
Can I ask belatedly that everyone identify themselves?
Okay, and belatedly, Jeff Laurenti. I'd be grateful if you could walk us through the degree of gubernatorial leadership such as there may have been over the years and through the various political regimes, constitutional regimes, on issues of race in the state. The section on Governor Broomfield says that he had played some role in managing, even though it was a powerless job, the legislation that was the last state to abolish slavery on a gradual emancipation basis. Yet exactly 40 years later, in the 1844 Constitution, the rights of blacks to vote were yanked.
Absolutely.
And was there a gubernatorial position on the part of whoever was governor at the time, either to wink or to accept that as proper? And then a century later, in the 40s, when we began having the lawsuits for school desegregation, right, even in this state, and the passage of anti-discrimination legislation, where before the days people of our generation remember Dick Hughes onward, were governors in dealing with the injustices of race that had been part of the American fabric from the founding?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'll give you my take on it. I don't claim it's the last word. Maxine might want to chime in. New Jersey does not have a noble history in this regard. You mentioned Bloomfield, and it's a very good choice because Bloomfield is the exception to the rule. He was a member of the Anti-Slavery Society. What percentage of New Jerseyans favored an anti-slavery position? The consensus view among the New Jersey elite on all sides of the political spectrum was colonization. And Vroom, who I admire, and as you've heard me say that I think he was a terrific governor, Vroom at one point said very straightforwardly, blacks and whites cannot live together amicably. And so colonization is the way it has to go. Samuel Southard, who was Vroom's tough opponent, felt exactly the same. They went to the same colonization society meetings. If you go further into the Civil War era to a governor like Joel Parker, he's terrible. He's almost as bad as the guy who you see in the film Lincoln, who's getting up and baiting Thaddeus Stevens, right, and the Republicans who are trying to pass the 14th Amendment. Joel Parker was a louse when it comes to race. I would say that most governors ignored the issue. Blacks were invisible to them, except insofar as if they were Democrats and there was a black coterie of voters, or Republicans and a black coterie of voters who might help them. You see this in Boardwalk Empire to some degree. They would, of course, offer a few nuggets in exchange for delivering the vote. But no, I don't think New Jersey has a record that is exemplary until we get into the modern era. And Driscoll, outstanding. Here's a little tidbit you won't know. You probably won't know. The first presidential appointment to his executive cabinet, or the executive staff of a black American, was a New Jerseyan. And that appointment was to Fred Morrow from Hackensack. That appointment was made by Dwight Eisenhower. But do you know how Dwight Eisenhower appointed Fred Morrow? In 1952, when the Eisenhower was running for president, and he wanted to try to do a little better with the black vote, one of his staff members talked to Alfred Driscoll and said, do you know anybody who can help us stump for the black vote and serve on the campaign train? And Alfred Driscoll said, there's a bright young man named Fred Morrow from Hackensack who can do this. And They appointed him, Morrow rode on the train, and as a result, a little bit later, he gets a job in the White House. So that was Driscoll's contribution, along with a number of anti-discrimination laws, as you know, and it's followed up by the subsequent governors. So I think our record since 47 is very good. I think our record before 47, pretty bad.
Dr. Birkner, it's going to be our last question.
Okay, sure.
Michael, I would add 2 things, okay? Actually, maybe 3 things really quickly. The first is that the black vote is not taken away by the 1844 Constitution. It's taken away in 1807 when they pass a law that makes it a white male vote. And the 1844 Constitution just repeats that. And how you amend the 1776 Constitution by passing a law is something I've never been able to explain to my students, but they do it, and the courts recognize it. The courts uphold it, okay? And the second, which I think is kind of interesting, Joseph Bloomfield was a soldier in the American Revolution. His father was a doctor who I think lived in Elizabethtown. And when the revolution is over, his father frees his slaves. This is Moses Bloomfield on July 4th. So, but I think clearly making a statement. So if he's involved in abolition, I think the tie is to his father. And then the third thing is, I would say Driscoll too, but the 1947 Constitution prohibited discrimination. And what Driscoll does is he immediately starts to enforce that provision. And New Jersey's the first state where the Constitution prohibits discrimination.
Exactly so. Thank you for that. I think there's one more you're going to allow me. Sir?
I'd like to bring it into the future. I'm a little prejudiced because I served in the Florio administration, but I think and I will predict that history will be kinder to Governor Florio than historians presently are. I don't think anyone has really dug into the depth of the opposition and the issues faced by Governor Florio when he took office. I think on style points, maybe you got a point, but in terms of energy and values, and clarity of purpose and honesty, he belongs in the outstanding group.
And I wouldn't disagree with you. I think that and I personally would put a plug in for William Cahill along the same lines. I feel that way about them. Thank you all. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you.